You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja.
We love the herb.
It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Monday, August 7th, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Welcome to the program. We've got a jam-packed show for you today, just chock full of cannabis news and especially cannabis science. That's right. It's time for our cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. He's back after a couple weeks being off the program, and we're going to start off by talking about a recent appearance by conservative commentator Ann Coulter, where she said marijuana makes people retarded and it's destroying the country. Also, she made this weird claim that black people lie on marijuana surveys more than white people. So we'll ask Dr. Mitch all about that and get the truth. Also, a look at a study on cannabis and exercise. We've got a look at cannabis edibles and the placebo effect. We've got a look at adult mental health outcomes for those who use marijuana on a regular basis, and another study on CBD and its use for people suffering from post-traumatic stress. That's all coming up in the Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. That's right after the cannabis headline news. And in the news, we've got a big breaking story that's happening from the National Conference of State Legislators. They are recommending the descheduling of cannabis. Take marijuana out of the federal scheduling altogether. Not rescheduling, not moving it to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. Remove it from the Federal Controlled Substances Act altogether and let the states settle the issue. So we'll bring you that in the news, plus some other headlines having to do with our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. He got kind of a bummer in a report. It kind of puts me in mind of 1972 when President Nixon commissioned this, he put this commission together to give him a report on marijuana, and he wanted to have a big scientific report just tearing the ass out of marijuana legalization. Nixon's words. And what he got was a report that told him, hey, you ought to just decriminalize this stuff. That made Nixon really mad. And I can imagine that's how mad Jeff Sessions is today as he got this latest report from the Marijuana Task Force. Also, coming up at the end of the show, time for a radical rant where we show you how Governor Christie and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio have failed Logic 101 when it comes to marijuana and opiates. But first, let's get to the news.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by MarijuanaMoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at MarijuanaMoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, August 7th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. The Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety, a group of prosecutors and federal law enforcement officials assembled to produce recommendations on marijuana policy to Attorney General Jeff Sessions, has come up with no new policy recommendations to advance his aggressively anti-marijuana views. The group's report largely reiterates the current Justice Department policy on marijuana. It encourages officials to keep studying whether to change or rescind the Obama administration's more hands-off approach to enforcement, a stance that has allowed the nation's experiment with legal pot to flourish. The report was not slated to be released publicly, but portions were obtained by the Associated Press. The task force suggestions are not final, and Sessions is in no way bound by them. On Friday, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican of Wisconsin, and John Conyers, a Democrat from Michigan, sent a letter to Attorney General Jeff Sessions to express concerns and objections to his proposal to expand the Department of Justice's civil asset forfeiture program. Congressman Sensenbrenner argued, quote, "Expanding the federal civil asset forfeiture program is a step in the wrong direction, and I urge Attorney General Sessions and his Department of Justice to reconsider. I am a supporter of criminal asset forfeiture, the seizure of property after the conviction of a crime. But with civil asset forfeiture, law enforcement has a direct economic incentive to take people's property without ever even charging them with a crime," end quote. Congressman Conyers added, quote, "I am deeply disappointed by the Justice Department's recent move to reverse its ban on adoptive seizures," end quote, the practice where federal authorities conduct seizures on behalf of state and local agencies whose hands are tied by reforms in state civil forfeiture law. The letter specifically asks if the federal authorities would adopt such a case, quote, "if the forfeiture were based on simple possession of marijuana in a state that has legalized the drug," end quote. Massroots reports that the National Conference on State Legislatures has endorsed a resolution that calls for the end of federal marijuana prohibition. Quote, "The Controlled Substances Act should be amended to remove cannabis from scheduling," the resolution concludes, thus enabling financial institutions the ability to provide banking services to cannabis-related businesses, end quote. In arguing for the descheduling of cannabis, NCSL states that, quote, "without banking options, cannabis-related businesses are forced to operate exclusively in cash," it says. "A large and growing cash-only industry attracts criminal activity and creates substantial public safety risks, and a cash-only industry reduces transparency in accounting and makes it difficult for the state to implement an effective regulatory regime that ensures compliance," end quote. The San Francisco Chronicle reports that a state appeals court has overturned a San Francisco teenager's conviction for illegal possession of a gun that police found in his backpack, which officers searched after smelling marijuana. The court said the scent of marijuana on the youth and his clothes wasn't enough to authorize the search without a warrant. The then 17-year-old was convicted by the juvenile court and the case affirmed in an appeal. However, the state Supreme Court had the appeals court reconsider the case in light of the Supreme Court's decision in another search case in December. In that case, the state's high court invalidated the search of a man who was stopped after rolling past a stop sign on his bicycle and said the crime, an infraction, was not legal grounds by itself for an arrest and search. Based on that precedent, the officers had no legal grounds to arrest the teenager or search his clothing or property without a warrant, Justice Peter Siggins said in a 3-0 ruling, which the court published Wednesday as a precedent for future cases. A committee convened by the Maine Department of Public Safety says it doesn't believe that Maine needs to set a limit for determining whether a motorist is impaired by marijuana. Maine Public Radio reports that committee chair Scott Maddox said the state need not alter its operating under the influence law or create new blood level limits for THC. Instead, he said lawmakers should provide additional funding to train police officers, prosecutors, and even judges to recognize marijuana impairment and its dangers while driving. He said there should be a robust public education campaign. Last year, a bill that would have set a THC limit failed in Maine. The legislature had a disagreement over what would be an appropriate limit to determine impairment. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, August 7th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hi, I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. If you appreciate my full-time dedication to reporting and analyzing the news about cannabis, consider becoming a patron of the show. For just $4.20 per month, you'll help keep my live stream and podcast free while earning yourself your own private ad-free podcast link for the show, as well as links to the supporting articles and data. For a $9.99 VIP subscription, you'll get all that plus my exclusive research, data tables, and graphics. Just log on to mjagenda.com and click the Become a Patron button today.
The Marijuana Agenda. Like the gay agenda, only with better music.
At Herbie's Cannabis Seeds, we pride ourselves on bringing you the best quality seeds from the world's most respected cannabis seed producers, all at the lowest online prices. You can find Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. All cannabis seeds are sold as souvenirs and as a means of preserving cannabis genetics. Herbie's Seeds in no way intends to condone, promote, or incite the use of illegal or controlled substances. We strongly urge all prospective customers to check their national laws prior to placing an order. Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. Proud sponsors of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
This is Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and author of numerous books and columns on cannabis science, culture, history, and medicine. Email your questions to Dr. Earlywine at 420research@gmail.com or call the Marijuana Agenda message line at 650-LEGAL-MJ. Now, here's your Cannabis Q&A.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of our Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine, where we review the latest in marijuana science. Dr. Mitch, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure.
Well, I'm so glad to get you on because a noteworthy expert on marijuana affairs recently reared her ugly head. Ann Coulter was in a debate recently at Politicon with Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks, and during the debate, when Anna Kasparian brought up the point about black folks and white folks using marijuana at the same rates, Ann brought up a retort that caught me by surprise, saying she had seen studies that showed that those figures are unfair for us to claim with the racial disparity because, in Ann Coulter's words, black people lie more on surveys of marijuana use. First time I've ever heard this, Dr. Mitch, and I wanted to get your opinion on that statement.
I have no data, and I've literally looked since you sent me this to suggest there aren't any racial differences on underreporting, and there actually are techniques for doing this. I've published research myself showing that people lie about committing anti-gay hate crimes, about telling racist jokes. They lie about the frequency of safe sex. And I have data to really show that. I have never seen any racial disparities on any measures of lying about anything, and certainly not about cannabis use.
Yeah, it seemed odd to me. I think Politico or one of the online features followed up on that, and Coulter had referenced some study about taking people's, self-reported marijuana use and then drug testing them later to find out if they'd actually had any drug in their system. But of course, we've reported before how that's disproportionately unfair to African Americans and Mediterranean people of Mediterranean descent when they're doing those kind of hair tests. Are there other indications that would make that skew more with a racial bias?
Actually, the study that did that compared the cannabis use, self-report, and urine screens doesn't show a racial disparity. So I really am kind of lost as far as how she got this into her head. I'm guessing she just misremembered it and thought it was consistent with her stereotypes and let it go from there.
Well, you've got to take anything with a grain of salt from a woman who says, quote, marijuana is making people retarded, end quote. So we'll leave that at that. Let's get to some real science here on the program. There was a recent study out, on cannabis and exercise performance as to whether or not it's performance enhancing for strength or aerobic activity. What did we get from this latest research?
I mean, the bottom line here is I'm delighted that anybody's, willing to take a look at this kind of work, and we don't want to start thinking about cannabis as a performance-enhancing drug. I know that sounds like a Robin Williams routine, but there are a subset of folks who genuinely do report, particularly in sort of aerobic-type work, that exercise-induced asthma is kind of inhibited as far as that goes. And then a number of folks who say they can lift more weight in part because of some of the anesthetic qualities of THC, but really don't see large sample work supporting the idea that cannabinoids really enhance aerobic exercise or strength. And so if you're believing it and it's working for you, by all means, be careful and go ahead. But the large sample reports just don't suggest that's the case.
So looking at that from the performance point of view, maybe not, but what happens as we look at recovery or rest or, coming back from an injury? Is cannabis helpful in any of those ways?
Unfortunately, there aren't enough studies to really draw any firm conclusions. Given cannabis's, pretty legendary anti-inflammatory qualities, it makes sense that should work, but we haven't seen data really say, hey, this is a good approach to training.
Another issue in doing these studies, especially when we want to go for those gold standard double-blind placebo-controlled studies, is the whole idea of this placebo effect, which I've always thought was kind of a strange thing to think about when we're talking about marijuana smoking, since you can feel it immediately. Wouldn't you know you're getting the placebo? But there's a new study out about placebo effects on edible cannabis, which I would think there could be something there because, you don't feel it so immediately. What do we know about this placebo effect on edibles and just in cannabis use in general?
So we are finding significant intoxication ratings at about half an hour out when folks are giving an edible placebo. I'm happy to say this is one of the few papers I've seen where most of the authors have actually been on the Rust Belt show.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of nice to see Mallory and Melissa and I did this. And Mallory really spearheaded this work. We got some of those rather distasteful, I'm afraid, cannabis lollipops, but they were placebo, so they tasted a bit like tasting, I don't know, your lawn or something. They really were not my favorite ingested cannabis edible. But at about that half-hour spot, folks are reporting an intoxication effect, and before they realize, hey, something's up, that would be the ideal time to then sort of test, is there a placebo-related change in, say, cognition or subjective effects or other measures. When they really genuinely do seem to believe they're intoxicated, it does wear off after time, and people do get suspicious, but it was neat to be able to see that effect. And we also have some fun things with, as you might guess, mood.
Yeah. So many of my listeners have said, boy, someday I want to be in one of Dr. Mitch's surveys, one of Dr. Mitch's experiments. Folks, every now and then you just might get the shitty tasting lollipop that doesn't get you high.
That's true. It's the risk you take in our lab.
I guess so. All right. There's a couple of other studies here, more like analyses. First one here in the Journal of Drug and Alcohol Dependence about the association between regular marijuana use and adult mental health outcomes. What do we take away from this one?
I mean, I think the real message to take away is just people are not randomly assigned to use cannabis for life. And so the chicken and egg problems really are huge as far as who might end up self-medicating depending upon what symptoms they're experiencing. But the highlights on this suggest that what a surprise, if you are a chronic marijuana user, you are more likely to report some of the symptoms of substance use disorders for other drugs, particularly tobacco-related ones. And then there is an association with generalized anxiety disorder. It's really hard to tease that apart, but I do think it's fair to say that there is a subset of folks who have that kind of paranoid reaction to cannabis occasionally, and if you're already a little bit high-strung, this may end up being problematic for you. I think the tacit assumption that marijuana is causing these problems is completely untested and probably untrue.
Yeah, and I would encourage listeners to not gloss over the very first part of your statement where you mentioned that we don't randomly assign people to smoke marijuana, so we can't really tease a lot of these things out. I'd point out that, where you grow up, where your circumstances in life are, that's going to have a lot to do with it. I mean, if you're a guy like me growing up in a trailer house in the rural West, you probably have more chance of smoking weed than, say, Donald Trump growing up in Manhattan with $1 million inheritance from his father. He's not going to be exposed to it, and hence he has not ever used drugs, at least according to his own testimony on the issue, his own stories on the issue. But I'd argue I've probably come out with better mental health.
I would say the data are on your side.
Thank you. Our final story in our cannabis Q&A here is about CBD. We've heard a lot about CBD, cannabidiol, and of course, we've also heard a lot about getting medical cannabis to our veterans and other victims of trauma who are dealing with post-traumatic stress. This study seems to put the two together and saying that cannabidiol has an effect on fear memories. So tell our listeners about this one. It's really fascinating.
This is super delightful to see these data, and the bottom line is that consolidation of fear in that hippocampus where memory really seems to by regular cannabidiol consumption. And I feel like we have more and more evidence that at least for folks who are at risk for a traumatizing thing, a regular, 10 to 50 milligram daily vitamin of cannabidiol is probably going to be a really good idea because you're less likely to have the memory consolidate and become a sort of PTSD type situation. But there are literally no effects on short-term memory at all for cannabidiol. So it's not as if you're sacrificing your memory function, and you're still, at least according to these animal data, relatively less likely to develop some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder.
So when we say consolidation of fear memories, is that like long-term storage, saving the file permanently, and CBD is disrupting the save process there?
Exactly. And what's neat is that it's doing so for the traumatic memory, but not for short-term memory in general.
Yeah. And so does this suggest then that CBD rather than THC is the direction that patients with those needs should be looking?
I do find that that's going to go down easier as a recommendation simply because CBD isn't psychoactive.
Yeah, good point. Well, Dr. Mitch, we're just about out of time here on our Cannabis Q&A, but I want to remind all the listeners out there that if you've got a question for Dr. Mitch Earlywine, you can always send it privately through the email at 420research@gmail.com. And who knows, some of these questions have actually become the basis of some of these studies that Dr. Mitch puts on. You could get the lousy tasting lollipop in the future. Who knows? Dr. Mitch, thanks for joining us again, and good luck on all your future research.
Have a great day, man.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJAgenda.com.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
You're not high. You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
And one of the parts of the American dream is we're going to come down very, very hard on this massive drug problem.
Okay, maybe you're a little high.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show.
Encourage people to use less drugs.
I am ill. That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Radical Rant.
Well, we have a couple of examples today in the Radical Rant of politicians, one Republican, one Democrat, but both from the Eastern Seaboard, who somehow fail Logic 101 whenever the subject of marijuana is brought up. That's the amazing power of marijuana. It's the drug that's so powerful that it affects the logic circuits of the people who don't even use it. So we start with Christie, where he is reacting to a bill by Senator Cory Booker. This is the bill that would not only remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, but also penalize states that maintain prohibition and racially disproportionate arrest rates. So this is the big story that Christie wanted to talk about, because Christie, as you know, is head of this anti-opioid commission that Donald Trump has put together. And he says that the legalization of marijuana is a terrible idea. He says, quote, "We're in the middle of an opioid crisis. We want to send a message that other drugs are okay to take. I just don't understand the logic there. Why don't we just legalize heroin? We could take all of it and get more tax money and have more people dying. I guess some people are willing to make that sacrifice, end quote. So the first thing you notice out of this is whenever someone's talking about marijuana that dislikes it, how quickly they have to bring up some other drug that's more dangerous and more deadly to make their point. Nobody's talking about legalizing heroin and getting more tax money through opioid deaths. That's ridiculous. And second of all, we are talking about the legalization of marijuana as a potential alternative to opiate drugs that people are taking and dying from. The idea isn't legalize all drugs and let the fun begin. It's, hey, people are getting into these opioids. A lot of them are getting into it because of the legal opioids being overprescribed by their doctors. So let's give them a different choice. Let's give them something else that they can use, something else their doctors can recommend that might not be so deadly, might not lead to so many deaths. How can that not be a good idea? Governor Christie would have more credibility being the chair of an anti-obesity commission than the anti-opiate commission. At least on the anti-obesity commission, he'd have some real-world knowledge of what's going on here. Marijuana smokers, by and large, Governor Christie, don't use other drugs. Marijuana smokers often gravitate toward marijuana because they don't want to get into other drugs, or they have gotten into other drugs, and marijuana was a way out of those drugs, a way out of those addictions, those dependencies. The people who tend to stay with marijuana, especially in their older years, are the people who've given up the other drugs in favor of marijuana. That's why we want to make it legal. And then, of course, the other politician is Mayor de Blasio. Mayor de Blasio in New York City. So Drug Policy Alliance, DPA, Cassandra Frederick, who does great work as their New York policy coordinator, they put out this report that talked about how it was called unjust criminal arrests for like Jim Crow marijuana arrests, they called it, which pointed out that in the previous administration under Mayor Bloomberg, marijuana arrests were 85 or 86% Black and Latino. For 3 years of Bloomberg, 86% Black and Latino arrests for marijuana possession. In the 3 years of de Blasio, it's been 85%. And they made a big point of this because de Blasio came in campaigning on the idea of racial justice, campaigning on the idea that we need to stop these disproportionately racist arrests that are happening in New York City. And so they're kind of holding his feet to the fire. Hey, you said you'd cut down on these racially disproportionate arrests. They're still 85% Black and Latino. So de Blasio's office, in total defiance of logic, tried to spin this by putting out a report that said Drug Policy Alliance's marijuana report is misleading. Arrests for possession down by over a third. As a result of this new policy, they say, arrests for marijuana possession are down 37% from almost 29,000 in 2013 to approximately 18,000 in 2016. This is translated into approximately 9,600 fewer arrests of Black and Latino New Yorkers for marijuana possession in 2016 as compared to 2013. A report released last month by the Drug Policy Alliance, a group committed to legalization, ignores these changes and the resulting reductions in marijuana possession arrests of Black and Latino New Yorkers. Okay, so let me translate for you. DPA said, hey, de Blasio, the marijuana arrest pie, 7 out of 8 slices in the marijuana arrest pie are still Black and Latino. And de Blasio's response was, well, that's misleading. Look how much smaller the pie is. Nobody's denying that the pie is smaller. We know you went from 29,000 arrests to 18,000 arrests. The point wasn't that you weren't reducing arrests. The point was that even though the pie is smaller, 7 out of 8 slices are still Black and Latino people. The point was the racial disparity, not the total amount of arrests. Yes, it's great that 9,600 fewer Black and Latino people got arrested, but they're still 7 times more likely to get arrested. That's all the time we got. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.